All right, get ready, because today we're going deep on some super interesting research that you sent our way about cloud security and AWS.
Mm.
It's called imconsole.pdf, and let me tell you, this document is a real eye-opener when it comes to the world of pen testing and vulnerabilities.
Absolutely, yeah.
We're going to be focusing on something called username enumeration.
Right.
But before we get too far into this, we need to keep in mind that shared responsibility model when we're talking about cloud security.
Of course.
This is where both the cloud provider, like AWS in this case, and the customer, like the people using AWS, have a role to play in making sure everything's locked down tight.
Yeah, it's a partnership, really.
Yeah,
AWS is taking care of the foundation, that core infrastructure of the cloud.
right.
But you, as the customer, you're responsible for securing everything you build on top of that.
Okay, that makes sense.
Your applications, your data, all of that.
So, with that in mind, let's jump into the first really interesting discovery from this research, and it's about this thing called username enumeration.
Right.
And get this can even happen to people who have MFA enabled.
Yeah, that's what's so fascinating about this.
Multi-factor authentication.
Yeah, you'd think that would be an ironclad defense.
Yeah.
But the researchers found a way to potentially, at least when it comes to finding out if a username actually exists on the system.
Wait, hold on. Are you saying that even if I have MFA turned on,
Yeah.
an attacker could still figure out if my username is even a real username?
Potentially, yeah.
How is that even possible?
So it all has to do with the way that the AWS login flow is designed.
Okay.
Even if you enter, let's say, the wrong password, the server, the AWS server, might respond differently, depending on whether the username is actually a valid one or not.
Oh, so it's not even about getting past the password. It's just about confirming whether or not the username even exists.
Exactly. It's about information leakage, those subtle signals that can give attackers a clue.
That is so sneaky.
Yeah, and what was even more surprising was that when the researchers reported this to Amazon,
Yeah.
they acknowledged the finding, but ultimately labeled it as an accepted risk.
An accepted risk. Okay, I'm going to need you to unpack that a bit.
Sure.
What does that actually mean when we're talking about a vulnerability like this?
It means that essentially Amazon knows about this,
Okay.
but they've decided that the risk it poses is low enough for them to, well, accept it.
Okay.
It's a judgment call, right?
Right.
They're weighing the impact of this vulnerability
Mm-hmm.
against how much it would cost and how much effort it would take to actually fix it.
I get that, but it still makes me a little nervous to hear that there's this thing out there and they're just like, yeah, we know about it.
I understand.
Is there nothing more they could do about it?
Well, what's interesting is that the researchers, even though Amazon said it was an accepted risk, they actually proposed some solutions.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, well, hold that thought because I definitely want to hear about those.
Sure.
But first, I think we need to talk about the second vulnerability they uncovered, which involves something called a timing attack.
Right.
Have you ever heard of those?
Oh, yeah, I've heard of them. They're fascinating and kind of scary in a way.
Yeah, is it an attack that happens at a specific time or something? I'm not really sure.
No, not quite.
Okay.
It has to do with how long a server takes to respond to a request.
Okay.
It's kind of like, imagine you're trying to guess someone's PIN at an ATM.
Okay.
You try a random number and you get it wrong. The machine's going to say, nope, try again pretty quickly.
Right.
But imagine if the ATM took a little bit longer to respond if you got the first digit of the PIN correct,
Right.
even if the rest of the numbers were wrong.
Oh.
That tiny delay could be a clue, right?
Yeah, it could be. Yeah.
That's kind of what a timing attack is all about. It's about picking up on these tiny, subtle variations in response times.
So it's about figuring something out even if you don't have all the information.
Exactly.
But how does that apply to AWS?
So the researchers found that in certain cases, the AWS server might take just a little bit longer to respond
Okay.
when a valid username is entered, even if the password is completely wrong. It's a tiny difference. We're talking milliseconds.
Right.
But for an attacker, that's enough to potentially exploit.
Wow. Milliseconds is nothing. I would never notice that.
Exactly.
How did they even figure that out?
They used a tool called Burp Suite,
Okay.
which is like a super powerful magnifying glass for network traffic, essentially.
Got it.
And what it does is it allows you to see exactly how a server responds to your request down to the millisecond.
Oh, wow.
And what they found was this consistent timing difference, about 100 milliseconds, when a valid username was used.
That's wild. So Burp Suite is letting them see things that, normal people would just never even be aware of.
Right, exactly.
But what's going on the AWS side that's actually causing this difference in timing?
It probably comes down to something called quick exit code,
Quick exit coder.
which is basically like a shortcut in the programming that can sometimes unintentionally leak information.
Hmm.
So imagine this. You're trying to get into a secure building, right?
Okay.
If you swipe a key card that's completely bogus, the system's going to be like, nope, invalid card.
Right.
But if you have a valid key card and enter the wrong PIN, the system might take a little bit longer to check that PIN.
Oh, right, right.
And that tiny hesitation could reveal that the key card itself is at least valid, even if you didn't get the PIN right.
Okay, I get it. So it's like the server saying, nope, never heard of that username versus, hold on, let me check this password. Darn, it's wrong, but hey, at least the username was legit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And unfortunately, this quick exit code issue is pretty common, not just with AWS, but in a lot of different systems out there.
I see. So this isn't even like unique to AWS.
Right. And there's actually a great resource called the OWASP Authentication Cheat Sheet.
Oh, the OWASP authentication cheat sheet. I'm writing that down.
It's fantastic.
Yeah.
It talks all about this problem and how to write more secure code
Okay, awesome.
that avoids these kinds of pitfalls.
Okay, so we've got these two vulnerabilities then, both related to username enumeration. And I gotta say, they're pretty concerning.
Yeah.
So what can people actually do to protect themselves?
Well, there are a few key things to keep in mind. Well, luckily, there are things you can do to really make yourself a much harder target.
Okay, good.
And first off, one of these vulnerabilities we talked about, it specifically targets users who don't have MFA.
Yeah, the one where the timing, like how long it takes the server to respond, could give away whether a username is even valid or not.
Exactly. So step one, enable MFA.
Okay, MFA. Got it.
For all your IAM users in AWS,
Right.
it just adds that extra layer of protection.
Okay, so MFA, check. What else?
Strong passwords.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Absolutely essential. And make them unique, make them complex. Don't use the same password you use for everything else.
Right.
In fact, AWS has this feature. It's called IAM password policy.
Okay.
You can use that to enforce strong passwords across your entire organization.
Got it. So MFA, strong passwords, anything else we can tweak on the AWS side to tighten things up?
While there's no magic setting that's just going to eliminate all risk robust logging and monitoring, that's your best friend.
Okay.
Remember we talked about CloudTrail?
Yeah, that's AWS's audit logging service, right?
It's like having a security camera for your whole cloud environment.
That's a good way to put it.
Make sure you've got detailed logging enabled
All right.
and that
Yeah.
you're actually taking the time to look through those logs, regularly just to see if anything weird is going on.
Yeah, and the best part is that AWS has a free tier for CloudTrail, so there's really no excuse not to have it set up.
Absolutely. Now, beyond just the AWS specific stuff, there's a lot that developers can do to prevent these types of vulnerabilities from happening in the first place.
Oh, yeah, like on the coding side of things.
Right, exactly. Remember we talked about that quick exit code?
Yeah, those little shortcuts that could accidentally leak information.
Right. And the AWASP authentication cheat sheet that we mentioned, it actually has some really great guidance on how to write secure code that doesn't fall into these traps.
Got it. I'll definitely have to check that out.
It emphasizes consistent server behavior no matter what username gets entered.
Yeah.
Think of it like your server's playing poker,
Right.
It's got to have a poker face no matter what username gets thrown at it.
No accidental tells. I like that analogy.
So yeah, developers need to be really mindful about how they handle authentication, right?
Yeah,
To prevent those timing discrepancies that attackers could exploit.
got it. No giving away any hints to the bad guys.
Exactly. It's about making it as hard as possible for them to get a foothold. And of course, just staying informed about emerging threats and vulnerabilities is key.
Oh, for sure. The threat landscape is constantly changing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a never-ending learning process, really.
All right, so we've covered prevention, but what about detection?
Mm.
How can people actually tell if one of these attacks is happening in their AWS account?
CloudTrail logs, that's your best bet.
Okay,
Look out for console login events
right.
with specific error messages.
Like what?
So for example, if you see no username found in supplied account, that can mean that someone's trying random usernames.
Okay, that makes sense.
And then failed authentication might be a sign that there's a timing attack going on.
So if I see a ton of either of those messages popping up, especially if they're coming from a bunch of different IP addresses, that's
Yeah.
a huge red flag.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's like seeing a bunch of people trying to pick the lock in your front door.
Right, you're definitely going to want to investigate that. This has all been super helpful, but I'm curious, how did AWS actually respond to the researchers who uncovered these vulnerabilities in the first place?
Hmm. It's kind of a mixed bag, actually.
What do you mean?
So remember that second vulnerability, the one about the timing attack without MFA?
Yeah, where they could exploit that tiny little delay in the server's response?
Right. Well, the good news is AWS acknowledged it.
Okay.
Assigned it a CVE identifier, that's CDE 2025-0693. So it's basically a unique ID for security vulnerabilities.
Okay.
And then they worked with the researchers to get it patched up.
Oh, okay, so they actually took it seriously
They did, yeah.
and fixed it. That's good.
But the first one, the one that involves username enumeration with MFA enabled,
One they said was an accepted risk.
yeah, that one's a little bit trickier. AWS still considers it an accepted risk,
Okay.
which means they don't currently plan to actually change that login flow.
But hold on, didn't you say that the researchers actually proposed some solutions for that, even though AWS was calling it an accepted risk?
Yes, exactly. And that's what I think is so impressive about this whole research.
Yeah.
They didn't just point out the problems, they actually brainstormed some potential fixes, even though AWS wasn't necessarily going to jump on them right away.
Okay, I really want to hear about those solutions.
Sure, so one idea they had was to change the login flow so it gives a more generic response no matter what,
Okay.
whether the username actually exists or not.
So instead of saying no username found, it would just be like invalid username or password.
Exactly, so you can't tell if you got the username right.
Ah, I see. So it's just like shutting down that whole avenue of information leakage.
Precisely. And another suggestion was to use something called rate limiting.
Oh, yeah, rate limiting. We talked about that earlier. That's like setting a speed limit for how many times someone can try to log in.
Right, so if someone's trying to log in too many times too quickly,
Yeah.
the system will just temporarily block them.
That makes sense.
Makes it much harder to do those brute force attacks where they just keep trying different usernames and passwords over and over again.
Right, and it probably makes it a lot harder for them to use automated tools.
Exactly, it slows them down,
Yeah.
so it makes their attacks less effective.
Okay, so it's like a combination of making the login process itself more secure and then also making it harder for attackers to just abuse the system, right?
And it really shows that security is all about layers.
Yeah.
It's not about finding one perfect solution that's going to block every single attack.
Right.
It's about having multiple safeguards in place to make it as tough as possible for attackers to get through.
I'm starting to see the big picture here, but we've been talking about a lot of really technical stuff.
We have, yeah.
So for someone who maybe isn't super familiar with all this security jargon, what would you say are the most important takeaways from all of this?
I think the biggest takeaway is that even in a system like AWS, which seems so secure, right, there can still be vulnerabilities, and they can be exploited in these really subtle ways that you might not even think about.
Yeah, you can't just assume that everything's safe just because it's in the cloud.
Exactly. You have to be vigilant. You have to stay informed.
Yeah, it's like anything else in life. You gotta be proactive.
Absolutely. And remember, security, it's a journey. It's not a destination.
Oh, I've heard that before.
Yeah, it's about constantly improving, staying up to date on the latest threats, and just always looking for ways to make things more secure.
So we've covered a ton of ground today. We talked about vulnerabilities, how to prevent them, how to detect them, even potential solutions.
Right.
What's the one big question that you really want to leave our listeners with?
Well, we've seen how these tiny little things, like how long a server takes to respond,
Yeah.
can be a huge clue for attackers.
Right.
So my question is, what other subtle hints or information leaks might we be overlooking in the systems we use every single day? What other hidden vulnerabilities are out there?
Wow. That's a great question. It really makes you think.
Right. It's all about thinking about security in every part of our digital lives.
This has been a fascinating deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
And until next time, stay curious and stay secure. We're back, and before we were talking about how the researchers who wrote this paper, they really went above and beyond,
They did.
proposing solutions even for that vulnerability that AWS was basically like, it's an acceptable risk.
Right.
I really want to know what they came up with.
Yeah, it's pretty cool, right? Instead of just saying, hey, here's a problem and walking away, they were like, okay, well, here's how to potentially fix it. Even though,
Yeah.
AWS might not necessarily be on board with implementing those fixes right away.
Yeah. So what were some of those suggestions?
So one idea was to, change the AWS login flow so that it gives like a more generic response,
Okay.
regardless of whether the username is actually valid or not.
So like no matter what username you type in, you get the same message back.
Yeah, exactly. So instead of it saying no username found, which could tip off an attacker that they got the username right, it would just say like invalid username or password.
Oh, I see. So it's like closing that little loophole where they could get that extra bit of information.
Right, exactly.
Fine.
And then another suggestion was to use rate limiting.
Rate limiting. Yeah, we talked about that before. That's like putting a speed limit on how many times someone can try to log in.
Yeah, exactly. So, if someone keeps trying to log in over and over and over again really quickly,
Right.
the system would just temporarily block them.
So it makes those brute force attacks a lot harder, right?
Exactly. And it would also make it harder to use automated tools to like quickly scan for usernames.
Right, because those tools would be hitting the server a ton of times, really fast.
Yeah, exactly. So it slows them down and makes it much harder for them to be effective.
Okay, so it's kind of like a two-pronged approach, right? You're making the login process itself more secure, and then you're also making it harder for the attackers to just abuse the system.
Yeah, exactly.
Keep hitting that server over and over again.
Right.
And it really highlights that security is all about layers, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's not about just finding one perfect solution that's going to, block everything.
Yeah. It's about having multiple safeguards in place to make it as hard as possible for attackers to get through.
And this document also really emphasized the importance of, logging and monitoring.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Because if you're really paying attention to those CloudTrail logs,
Right.
you can spot suspicious activity that might be a sign of an attack.
Absolutely.
Even if it's something really subtle, like a timing attack.
It's like having a detective with a magnifying glass looking for those tiny little clues.
That's a good way to put it.
And, AWS provides a free tier for CloudTrail, so there's really no excuse not to have that detailed logging enabled.
So you can go back and see who did what and when, just in case something shady's going on.
Exactly.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive into the world of AWS security.
It has, yeah.
We've talked about the vulnerabilities, how to protect yourself, how to spot attacks, even some potential solutions.
Right, and I think it really highlights that security is a shared responsibility, right?
Yeah, for sure.
It's not just on AWS to secure their platform. It's on us as users and developers to, do our part.
Yeah, we've got to be proactive.
Exactly. We have to stay informed. We have to keep learning and just constantly be thinking about how to improve our security practices.
And sometimes it's the smallest details, like a few milliseconds here or there, that can make all the difference.
Absolutely.
So to everyone listening out there, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay secure.